Congratulations. You have made it to your fantasy championship, and we're here to help you bring home that trophy. Joining me today, SI's senior fantasy analyst, Michael Fabiano, to help you make all those best start-sit decisions. Okay, Fabs, this is for all the marbles. You say you're going to start Dak Prescott and Justin Fields this week.
Yeah, two very good options. Maybe a little bit of low-hanging fruit, but there's not that many teams left in most fantasy leagues right now. Dak, his last few games have not been great. He's been much better at home. That's where he plays this week at Jerry World. The Lions giving up right around 21 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks over the last 4 weeks. The Vegas total's well over 50. This is going to be a high-scoring affair. Start Dak and start Justin Fields, who we told you to play last week. He had well over 20 fantasy points. I think you can hit that number again against Atlanta. They've allowed 17-plus points to quarterbacks 7 times this year, including 4 who've gone over 20. They've also given up the 7th most rushing yards to quarterbacks, and that's a big deal because we know Fields is such a mobile quarterback. So start Justin Fields.
It's no secret that the last few weeks have been a little wild in the fantasy world, so you've got some interesting sits here. 1, Tua Tagovailoa, who I assume has to do with the matchup, and number 2, you're telling us to sick Jake Browning, and you'd think that's well done, but actually Jake Browning's been one of the best quarterbacks across the past few weeks as far as fantasy points, but you say maybe not this week.
Yeah, we'll start off with Tua. Tua has not been great lately. I mean, fewer than 16 fantasy points in 4 of his last 5 games. Now he's got Baltimore. Now, Baltimore could let down after a huge road win against the 49ers. And remember, the last time these two teams played, Tua went off, and Lamar Jackson did too. But the bottom line here is that if you follow the process says to fade Tua. And yet, Jake Browning, since week 13, is in the top 8 among fantasy quarterbacks. It's crazy to think that, but I'm not going to play him against Kansas City. They have allowed just one quarterback to score more than 18.9 points against them at Arrowhead Stadium. That is not a great ceiling for Jake Browning. I am keeping him on the fantasy sidelines, especially with the injuries there to Jamar Chase.
Let's jump over to the running back position. Give me a pair of running backs you're definitely starting this weekend.
I like DeAndre Swift, and we liked him last week. He finally got into the end zone. He had a pretty good game. He has had 20 touches in 2 straight games. He's got the Cardinals this week. Their defense has allowed the 3rd most fantasy points to running backs in the last 4 weeks. So Swift is a nice flex starter, and so is Javonte Williams. And really, Javonte hasn't been great. I mean, fewer than 11 fantasy points in 5 of his last 6 games. But that one game was against the Chargers, who, oh, by the way, they face this week. So keep that in mind. The Chargers, 9th most running back points allowed for the season. So Javonte Williams should be in your starting lineup.
Moving over to your sit list, you're definitely starting Dak Prescott, and I'm sure you're definitely starting CeeDee Lamb. But you say no go with Tony Pollard, who could have been one of the bigger fantasy busts this season. And there's another young stud that you also say use caution with.
Yeah, both of these players are kind of either start them with caution or temper your expectations. And Tony Pollard, I mean, you said it. I mean, he's one of the biggest disappointments in fantasy football this season. Single-digit points in each of his last couple of games. And the Lions have allowed the fewest points to running backs on runs alone. They've also allowed the fewest points to running backs overall. This is a very tough defense. They've given up the fewest rushing yards to running backs of any team in the National Football League. So beware Pollard. And then Achane, who is still dinged up. And I think that's probably why his numbers have gone down and the volume of touches has gone down over the last few weeks. His last couple of games have not been great. And again, matchup against Baltimore, they are very tough at home typically. Now, this game could go sideways and could end up being a scoreboard scorcher. But if you look at the numbers, Achane's a risky flex at best.
Moving over to the wide receiver position, it looks like CJ Stroud is on track to start Sunday, fingers crossed. And if so, you say go ahead and fire up Nico Collins.
Right, Nico Collins, who last week got into the end zone, didn't have a huge stat line. But Nico, when healthy, has been a pretty solid fantasy option. And the matchup is right this week, Jen, against the Tennessee Titans. They've given up the 4th most receiving yards and the 5th most fantasy points to the perimeter. So Nico Collins is a good play. And Deebo Samuel as well. I know last week he did not have a great game against the Baltimore Ravens, but in his previous 4 games, I mean, he had gone nuclear. And this is the Commanders. This is a great matchup. Brandon Ayuk, Deebo Samuel, both in my top 12 among wide receivers this week. Start them both. I think Deebo could have the bigger game, though. Both players are excellent options in championship week.
Now we're moving over to your sit list, and you have a pair of players on here who may have gotten you through your matchup last week, or you may have just seen them go off on your bench. But you say beware, don't chase those points this week.
Or Calvin Ridley had a huge game last week, had a couple of touchdowns. We actually told you, get him into your lineup. The matchup was right. It's not right this week, though, against the Carolina Panthers. They've surrendered the fourth fewest points to opposing perimeter receivers over the last 4 weeks, and Trevor Lawrence is banged up. So there's the possibility that we could see C.J. Beathard. That would not be good for Calvin Ridley. And George Pickens, he went crazy last week. He went more than nuclear. 35.5 fantasy points, almost 200 receiving yards, got into the end zone a couple of times. But that was his first big game in about 2 months. In fact, he had failed to score double digits in 7 of his previous 8 games, Jen. So this is not a guy who's very consistent. Seattle's only given up 4 touchdowns to wide receivers in Seattle this season. So George Pickens is no lock to be a starter.
Moving to the tight end position, there's quite a few of us out there who lost TJ Hawkinson this week. Cole Kmet's kind of banged up. Michael Mayer's banged up. The list is long, so I think there's going to be a lot of claims on the waiver wire. You've got a couple guys you say you should definitely start with confidence this week, one of which might even still be on the waiver wire.
Right. We'll start off with Trey McBride. Last week, the numbers weren't great. He was held under 10 points, and we were expecting more. I think you'll get more from him this week against the Philadelphia Eagles. They've allowed 10-plus points to tight ends 7 times, including 5 who've gone over 15. So McBride should continue to be in your starting lineup. And how about Gerald Everett? 8 targets in 3 straight games. The numbers have not been bad. He's not putting up huge Antonio Gates-like numbers, but he's doing very well. Certainly, Easton Stick has some confidence in him. And you've got the Broncos this week. No team has allowed more touchdowns or fantasy points to opposing tight ends. So start Gerald Everett if you're in a pinch.
And as far as who you're sitting, Dalton Kincaid, once a darling for all of us, hasn't been as good with Cole Kmet back on the field, and you're also not starting Dalton Schultz in Houston.
It's not a good week to be a Dalton, apparently, at the tight end. Dalton Kincaid is droppable at this point. Ever since Dawson Knox has come back, he's disappeared. He has had 2 games of his last 3 with fewer than 2 points. In 1 game, he didn't score. It's brutal. Not only that, the Patriots are very tough on tight ends. Only 2 touchdowns allowed to the position. So fade Kincaid. Hey, I'm a poet and didn't know it. And Dalton Schultz as well. I know he had a good game last week, 14 points. And if CJ Stroud is back, maybe you play him as a back-end tight end 1. But the Titans have been really tough on that position. In fact, the best numbers that an opposing tight end have scored against Tennessee, 10.9 points. That is a very low ceiling for Dalton Schultz.
Not only has Dalton Kincaid disappeared, so has Stephon Diggs. Can we put his face on a milk carton? Stephon, come on, it's our championship week. Get it together. All right, guys, this is it. This is all the marbles. We will have all the most up-to-date information for you at si.com/fantasy. Who to start, who to sit, who's on the injury watch, who to pick up on the waiver wire. Be sure you find it there. Good luck this weekend. You're going to win it.